The rope that held the rope hung over Hacksaw Ridge like a lifeline between heaven and hell, its fibers dark with rain and already showing the strain of too much weight. Sergeant Mills tested it one more time, his calloused hands running along the length that would carry wounded men down the sheer cliff face to safety. Below them, the 77th Infantry Division's aid station waited in the pre-dawn darkness, stretchers lined up like wooden crosses in the mud. "Doss," Mills called softly, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery. "You sure about this? Going back up there without a weapon?" Desmond Doss adjusted his medic's kit and looked toward the ridgeline, where muzzle flashes flickered like deadly fireflies in the morning mist. The failed assault 3 hours earlier had left dozens of wounded men scattered across the plateau, crying weakly for help that hadn't come. When the retreat order echoed down the cliff face, the able-bodied had scrambled to safety, but the wounded remained, too heavy to carry in a fighting withdrawal, too exposed for a conventional evacuation. "I can't leave them up there, Sergeant," Doss replied, his hands trembling slightly as he checked his bandages and tourniquets. The abandoned DP-27 machine gun lay nearby, its Soviet markings a reminder of how desperate the fighting had become. "Every one of those men has a mother waiting at home." The rope creaked in the wind, and Mills shook his head. "That line's going to fray, maybe break altogether if we keep using it. And the Japs know we're here now. They'll be waiting." But Doss was already moving toward the cliff face, his Bible pressed against his chest beneath his gear. The first wounded man, Private Rodriguez, lay unconscious 20 yards from the edge, his left leg twisted at an impossible angle. As Doss knelt beside him, applying a field dressing with practiced efficiency, he could hear other voices calling from the darkness, weak cries for water, for morphine, for their mothers. "Rodriguez can hear me," Doss whispered to himself, a prayer as much as a medical assessment. "You're going home, son, I promise." The evacuation harness felt rough against his hands as he worked it around Rodriguez's shoulders, every movement deliberate despite the exhaustion that made his vision blur. Somewhere in the coral caves above, Japanese soldiers were repositioning, their whispered commands drifting across the ridge like ghosts. The rope would hold Rodriguez's weight, Doss told himself. It had to hold. As he lowered the unconscious soldier over the edge, Doss caught sight of the DP-27 again, its barrel gleaming with moisture. Any other medic would have grabbed the weapon, would have at least considered the protection it offered. But Doss's hands remained on the rope, guiding Rodriguez's descent through the darkness toward the aid station below. 16 more wounded men lay scattered across Hacksaw Ridge, 16 more trips to the rope. 16 more chances for the fraying line to snap, for Japanese snipers to find their mark, for his own faith to crack under the weight of what seemed impossible. The rope held. Rodriguez reached the bottom safely, and Doss turned back toward the ridge, where Private Chen was calling weakly for help, his voice barely audible over the rain that had begun to fall on Okinawa's blood-soaked coral. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The second evacuation nearly broke Doss's resolve before it began. Private Chen, barely 18 and delirious with fever from an infected shrapnel wound, fought against the rope harness like a drowning man fighting his rescuer. His eyes rolled white in the darkness, and his hands clawed at Doss's uniform as another wave of Japanese mortar fire walked across the ridge. "I can't see the bottom," Chen whispered, his voice cracking with terror. "Doc, I can't see anything down there." Doss steadied the boy's shoulders, feeling the tremor in his own hands that had started during the first evacuation and hadn't stopped. The rope showed more wear now. Several strands had parted near the anchor point, leaving dark fibers hanging loose like broken prayers. Below them, voices called up from the aid station, but the words were lost in the wind and rain that swept across Okinawa's exposed plateau. "The medics are waiting for you, Chen. Trust the rope." Doss's voice carried more confidence than he felt. The harness creaked, as Chen's weight settled into it, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, Doss wondered if this would be the evacuation that sent both the wounded soldier and the fraying line into the abyss. From somewhere in the coral caves, a Japanese rifle cracked. The bullet whined past Doss's ear, close enough to feel the displaced air, but he didn't flinch toward the abandoned DP-27 lying 10 yards away. Instead, he focused on the rope, on the rhythm of lowering Chen hand over hand, on the prayer that had become his anchor. Please, Lord, just let me get one more down safely. Chen disappeared over the edge, his fevered moans fading into the darkness below. The rope went slack, then jerked twice, the signal that he'd reached the aid station alive. But as Doss coiled the line for the third evacuation, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. More strands had parted during Chen's descent. The rope that had seemed so solid an hour ago was beginning to unravel under the strain. Corporal Williams lay 30 yards away, conscious but unable to move his legs. He'd been calling for help since the retreat order, his voice growing weaker as shock set in. As Doss crawled across the muddy ground toward him, Japanese voices echoed from a collapsed cave entrance, barely 50 meters away. They knew about the evacuation now. They were positioning for a cleaner shot. "Williams, can you hear me?" Doss knelt beside the corporal, whose face was pale in the pre-dawn light. A mortar fragment had torn through his lower back, and dark stains spread across the mud beneath him. "Doc, I thought you'd gone down with the others." Williams managed a weak smile. "Heard you don't carry a rifle, that true?" "It's true." Doss worked quickly, applying pressure bandages and checking Williams for other injuries. "But I carry something better, the promise that nobody gets left behind." The rope felt different in his hands as he secured Williams for the third descent. Rougher now, with loose fibers that caught on the harness buckles. The Japanese voices had grown closer, and Doss could see movement in the tree line, where enemy soldiers were advancing under cover of the morning mist. The DP-27 machine gun lay within arm's reach, loaded and ready, but Doss closed his eyes and focused on the weight of Williams settling into the harness. "Lord, please let this rope hold," he whispered as he began the descent. "Just one more time." Williams reached the bottom safely, but when the rope came back up, Doss could see that several more strands had snapped. The line that had to carry 14 more wounded men looked like it might not survive another 5 evacuations. And somewhere in the growing daylight, Japanese soldiers were taking aim at the one American medic foolish enough to work in the open without a weapon. The rain continued to fall on Hacksaw Ridge, and Doss turned toward Staff Sergeant Kowalski, who lay unconscious near a shell crater, blood seeping from a head wound that would require every bit of skill Doss possessed. The rope would hold, he told himself. It had to hold, because the alternative, leaving wounded men to die while he climbed to safety, was unthinkable. Staff Sergeant Kowalski weighed over 200 pounds, and his shattered ribs made every breath a struggle that Doss could hear from 10 feet away. As the first light of dawn crept across Okinawa's coral plateau, Doss realized that this evacuation would test not just the fraying rope, but the limits of his own endurance. His arms already ached from the previous lowerings, and his hands were raw from the coarse fibers that seemed to cut deeper with each trip to the cliff edge. "Easy, Sergeant. I'm getting you out of here." Doss applied fresh bandages to Kowalski's head wound, working by touch in the grey light that made every shadow look like an enemy soldier. The Japanese patrol he'd spotted earlier had disappeared into the cave system, but their voices still echoed across the ridge, closer now, more urgent. Kowalski's eyes fluttered open as Doss worked the evacuation harness around his massive chest. "Doss? That you, son?" His voice was thick with blood and confusion. "Where's your rifle?" "Don't carry one, Sergeant. Never have." Doss tested the harness buckles, his movements automatic despite the exhaustion that made his vision blur. "But I carry something better. The promise that you're going home to see your wife again." The rope felt different this time as Doss prepared for the fourth descent. Rougher, with loose strands that caught on everything they touched. When he tested it against Kowalski's weight, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the soft pop of fibers parting under strain. The line was failing, and 13 more wounded men still lay scattered across the ridge. From the aid station below, a voice called up through the morning mist. "Doss, how many more up there?" It was Dr. Martinez, the 77th Infantry Division's chief medical officer, his words barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery from other sectors of the Okinawa campaign. 13, Doss called back, his voice hoarse from hours of whispered prayers and shouted reassurances. 13 more coming down. But even as he spoke, Doss wondered if the rope would last that long. Each evacuation put more stress on the remaining fibers, and Kowalski's weight would strain the line more than the previous 3 combined. As he began the careful process of lowering the unconscious sergeant, Doss found himself holding his breath with each hand-over-hand movement. Halfway down the cliff face, the rope jerked violently. Doss felt his heart stop as several more strands parted with sounds like small-caliber rifle shots. Kowalski swayed in his harness, still unconscious, while Doss fought to control the descent with a line that seemed ready to snap completely. "Hold on, Sergeant," Doss whispered, though Kowalski couldn't hear him. "Just hold on." The rope held, barely. When Kowalski reached the aid station, the returning line showed damage that made Doss's hands shake as he examined it. Nearly half the strands had parted, leaving a cord that looked more like twisted hemp than military-grade rope. 13 more evacuations seemed impossible. Yet Private Santos lay 20 yards away, calling weakly for water, and beyond him, Lieutenant Morrison was unconscious and bleeding from abdominal wounds. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. As Doss made his way toward Santos, the abandoned DP-27 machine gun caught his eye again. One burst from that weapon could clear the cave mouths where Japanese soldiers were positioning for better shots. One magazine could buy him the time to complete the remaining evacuations without taking fire. But Doss's hands remained empty except for his medical kit, and his lips moved in silent prayer as he knelt beside Santos. "I'm sorry, Doc," Santos whispered, as Doss checked his wounds. "I'm so heavy." "Just leave me here. Nobody gets left behind," Doss replied, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised him with its strength. "That's not how this works." The rope would hold, he told himself, as he prepared Santos for the 5th descent. It would hold because it had to hold, because 13 men lay wounded on Hacksaw Ridge, and only one fraying line connected them to life. In the growing daylight, Japanese soldiers moved through the coral caves like shadows, and somewhere far below, Dr. Martinez waited for the next wounded soldier to descend from what seemed like an impossible rescue. The rain had stopped, but the rope remained slick with moisture and blood from Doss's torn hands. 13 more times, he told himself. 13 more prayers. 13 more chances for the line to snap and send a wounded man falling to his death. But as he began Santos's descent, Doss felt something he hadn't expected, a strange peace that came from knowing exactly what he had to do, regardless of the cost. The rope might fail. The Japanese might find their mark, but until that happened, he would keep going back to the edge. One more man, always one more man. The 10th evacuation nearly broke more than just the rope. Private Yamamoto, a Japanese-American soldier from Hawaii, whose presence in the 77th Infantry Division had raised eyebrows in some quarters, lay semi-conscious near a shell crater, his right arm hanging at an impossible angle. As Doss worked to stabilize the fracture, enemy voices called out from the cave mouths in a language Yamamoto understood but couldn't answer. "They're saying..." Yamamoto's voice was barely a whisper. "They're saying there's an American who won't die. A ghost medic." His eyes found Doss's face in the grey dawn light. "They're afraid of you, Doc." Doss felt no satisfaction in that knowledge. only the weight of 7 more wounded men who needed to reach the rope before the line finally snapped. The evacuation harness felt rough against his torn hands as he worked it around Yamamoto's shoulders, every movement careful despite the exhaustion that made his arms tremble. Below them, the aid station had grown quiet. Dr. Martinez and his staff overwhelmed by the steady stream of casualties descending from Hacksaw Ridge. The rope showed catastrophic damage now. More than half the strands had parted, leaving a line that looked like it belonged in a sailor's worst nightmare rather than a life-saving evacuation. But as Doss tested it against Yamamoto's weight, he felt something that defied logic. The remaining fibers seemed to grip each other more tightly, as if the rope's will to hold had grown stronger as its physical strength diminished. "Yamamoto, you're going to feel a jerk when the harness takes your weight," Doss explained as he prepared for the descent. "Don't fight it. Let the rope carry you." The 10th evacuation proceeded smoothly until Yamamoto was halfway down the cliff. Then the rope jerked violently, and Doss heard the sickening sound of more fibers parting under strain. For a moment that lasted forever, Yamamoto hung suspended in space, while Doss fought to control a line that seemed determined to fail. But the rope held. Somehow, impossibly, it held. As Doss pulled the harness back up for the 11th evacuation, he noticed something that made him pause. The remaining strands had woven themselves into a pattern that looked almost deliberate, as if the rope had learned to distribute weight in ways its manufacturers never intended. It was still failing, still dangerous, but it was failing slowly, giving Doss just enough time for what seemed impossible. Lieutenant Morrison lay unconscious near the ridgeline, blood seeping from shrapnel wounds that had penetrated his abdomen. As the senior officer still on the ridge, Morrison represented both a tactical priority and a personal burden. The man who'd given the orders that led to this disaster, now helpless and dependent on the medic he'd once questioned about carrying no weapon. "I've got you, Lieutenant," Doss whispered as he worked to stabilize Morrison's injuries. From the cave mouths, Japanese voices had grown more urgent. They were planning something, a final assault perhaps, or a concentrated effort to eliminate the American medic who'd been evacuating their enemies under their noses for hours. The 11th evacuation was the longest yet. Morrison's injuries required a slower descent, and the rope creaked ominously with each foot of progress down the cliff face. Doss found himself praying not just for the rope to hold, but for Morrison to survive the journey, for the lieutenant to have the chance to write the after-action report that would somehow explain what had happened on Hacksaw Ridge. When Morrison reached the bottom safely, the returning rope showed damage that made Doss wonder if he'd finally pushed the line beyond its limits. Only a few dozen strands remained intact, twisted together in a pattern that looked more like an accident than engineering. 6 more wounded men lay on the ridge, and Doss could hear Japanese soldiers moving through the coral caves with the purposeful sound of troops preparing for action. The abandoned DP-27 machine gun lay where Sergeant Mills had left it hours earlier, its barrel now slick with morning dew. One burst from that weapon could scatter the enemy soldiers, could buy Doss the time he needed to complete the remaining evacuations. But as he turned toward Corporal Jackson, wounded in both legs and calling weakly for help, Doss kept his hands empty except for his medical kit and his faith. "Jackson, can you hear me?" Doss knelt beside the young corporal, whose face was grey with shock and loss of blood. "I'm getting you off this ridge." "Doc," Jackson's voice was barely audible. "That rope don't look like it'll hold a sparrow, much less a full-grown man." Doss tested the harness buckles with hands that had been cut raw by hours of handling the fraying line. "It's held 10 men already. It'll hold 10 more if that's what it takes." But even as he spoke, Doss could see the truth in Jackson's eyes. The rope was dying by degrees, giving up its strength one strand at a time. The mathematical certainty was undeniable. At some point, probably soon, the line would snap completely. The question wasn't whether the rope would fail, but whether it would hold long enough for the last wounded man to reach safety. As he began Jackson's descent, Doss found himself thinking not about heroism or medals, but about the simple arithmetic of survival. 6 more men, 6 more prayers, 6 more chances for everything to fall apart. The rope groaned under Jackson's weight, and somewhere in the coral caves, Japanese soldiers prepared for whatever came next. The 13th evacuation revealed the secret that Desmond Doss would never share with the medal committees, the newspaper reporters, or even his own family. As he prepared Sergeant Baker for descent, a man whose screams had echoed across Hacksaw Ridge for hours, Doss felt something snap inside his own mind, a fraying that had nothing to do with rope fibers or enemy fire. "Make it stop," Baker pleaded, his hands clawing at wounds that had torn through his chest and shoulder. "Please, Doc, just make it stop." For the first time since the evacuations began, Doss hesitated. His medical kit contained morphine, enough to ease Baker's pain, or enough to ease it permanently. The thought lasted only a moment, but it was there. How simple it would be to give Baker the peace he begged for, to spare him the agony of being lowered down a cliff face on a rope that might snap at any moment. The thought terrified Doss more than enemy fire, more than the mathematical certainty that the rope would eventually fail. His hands shook as he applied fresh bandages to Baker's wounds, and for the first time since childhood, his silent prayers felt like they were falling into empty air. "I'm not built for this," he whispered to himself as he worked the evacuation harness around Baker's torso. "Lord, I'm not strong enough for this." But Baker was ready for descent, and below them, Dr. Martinez waited with the handful of medics who'd been receiving wounded soldiers all night. The rope showed damage that defied belief. Perhaps a dozen strands still held together, twisted into a pattern that looked more like desperation than engineering. Yet somehow, impossibly, it continued to hold weight. The 13th evacuation proceeded in silence. Baker had lost consciousness during the harnessing, his body limp and heavy in Doss's arms as he guided the descent. The rope creaked with each foot of progress, and Doss found himself holding his breath until he felt the familiar double-jerk signal from below. When the harness came back up, Doss stared at the remaining rope with something approaching disbelief. The line that had carried 13 wounded men down a cliff face now looked like the work of a drunk sailor, all loose ends and impossible knots. Yet it had held. Against all logic, against all engineering principles, it had held. 4 more wounded men remained on the ridge, and in the growing daylight, Doss could see Japanese soldiers moving through the coral caves with the confident movements of troops who knew they had their enemy trapped. The abandoned DP-27 machine gun lay nearby, its presence a constant reminder of the choice Doss refused to make. 1 weapon, 1 magazine, 1 betrayal of everything he believed, and he could probably clear the cave mouths long enough to complete the remaining evacuations safely. Instead, he crawled toward Private Kowalski, no relation to the sergeant he'd evacuated earlier, who lay unconscious near a shell crater, his left leg twisted beneath him at an angle that suggested multiple fractures. As Doss worked to stabilize the injuries, he found himself thinking about home, about his wife Dorothy waiting for news, about the church services where his faith had seemed so simple and clean. Nothing felt simple on Hacksaw Ridge. Faith meant continuing to lower wounded men on a rope that should have snapped hours ago. Faith meant keeping his hands empty while enemy soldiers positioned for killing shots. Faith meant accepting that he might not survive to see Dorothy again, that his last act might be the moment when the rope finally failed and sent a wounded soldier falling to his death. "I don't understand what you want from me," Doss prayed silently as he prepared Kowalski for evacuation. "But I'm still here. We're all still here." The 14th evacuation tested both the rope and Doss's sanity. Kowalski's weight put stress on strands that looked ready to part if someone breathed on them wrong, and the descent took longer than any before it. Doss found himself praying not just for the rope to hold, but for his own mind to hold, for the strength to continue functioning while everything rational told him to stop. When Kowalski reached the bottom safely, The returning rope looked like something from a nightmare. The few remaining strands had twisted into configurations that seemed to violate the laws of physics, yet somehow maintained enough integrity to support human weight. 3 more wounded men lay on the ridge, and Doss could hear Japanese voices growing closer, more confident. The secret he would carry for the rest of his life wasn't about heroism or divine intervention. It was simpler and more terrifying, the knowledge that he'd continued functioning long past the point where any reasonable person would have stopped. The rope should have failed. His body should have collapsed from exhaustion. His mind should have cracked under the pressure of making life-and-death decisions, while enemy soldiers tried to kill him. But he was still moving, still working, still lowering wounded men down an impossible cliff face on a rope that defied every law of engineering and common sense. And that continuation, that stubborn refusal to accept failure, felt less like heroism than like a kind of madness that happened to save lives. As he crawled toward Private Murphy, the 15th man, wounded in both arms and barely conscious, Doss wondered if he would remember any of this clearly when it was over. Already, the night's events seemed to blur together in his memory, like scenes from someone else's nightmare. Only the rope remained constant, hanging over the cliff edge like a thread connecting the possible with the impossible. The final 3 evacuations took place in full daylight, with Japanese soldiers close enough that Doss could see their faces as they positioned for shots that never came. Private Murphy went down 15th, his broken arms making the harness difficult to secure. Corporal Chen, no relation to the earlier Private Chen, descended 16th, unconscious from blood loss and shock. And finally, as enemy voices called across the ridge with what sounded like angry confusion, Doss prepared Lieutenant Rogers for the 17th and final descent. "Why haven't they shot you yet?" Rogers whispered, as Doss worked the evacuation harness around his shoulders. The lieutenant's leg was shattered below the knee, but his mind remained clear enough to recognize the impossibility of what had been happening all night. "I don't know," Doss replied honestly. He'd been asking himself the same question for hours. Japanese soldiers had been within rifle range multiple times, had taken aimed shots at the American medic working in the open. Some rounds had come close enough to feel, but none had found their mark. Luck, divine intervention, enemy confusion. Doss no longer cared about explanations. He cared only about getting Rogers to the rope. The line that had carried 16 wounded men down Hacksaw Ridge now consisted of perhaps 6 strands, twisted together in a pattern that looked more like macrame than military equipment. When Doss tested it against Rogers's weight, he heard sounds that made his heart skip, the soft popping of individual fibers giving way under strain that should have been catastrophic hours ago. "This rope isn't going to hold," Rogers said quietly, as Doss prepared for the final evacuation. "You know that, don't you? It's held 16 men already." Doss's voice carried a conviction that surprised him. "It'll hold 1 more. But as he began Rogers's descent, Doss felt the rope behaving differently than ever before. Each foot of progress brought new sounds of failure, strands parting, fibers stretching beyond their limits, the line itself seeming to acknowledge that it had reached the end of its impossible endurance. Rogers swayed in his harness, conscious enough to feel every jerk and slip as the rope gave up its strength strand by strand. Halfway down the cliff face, the inevitable finally happened. The rope snapped. For a moment that lasted forever, Rogers fell through empty air while Doss watched in horror from above. But the line didn't fail completely. 3 strands held, stretching like guitar strings under Rogers's weight while he swayed against the cliff face, still 30 feet above the aid station. "Hold on!" Dr. Martinez called from below as medics scrambled to position themselves for a possible catch. "We're getting another rope." But there was no other rope, no backup line that could reach Rogers before the remaining strands gave way completely. From the coral caves, Japanese soldiers watched the drama unfold with what seemed like fascination rather than bloodlust, as if they too had become invested in the outcome of this impossible rescue. Doss made a decision that would haunt him for decades. Instead of waiting for help that wouldn't arrive in time, he grabbed the parted end of the rope and began a hand-over-hand descent down the cliff face, using his own body weight to control Rogers's fall. His torn hands, already raw from hours of handling the line, began bleeding immediately as he slid down the few remaining strands. The descent took less than a minute, but felt like hours. Doss's weight added to the strain on the dying rope, and he could feel individual fibers parting under his hands as he controlled Rogers's descent. When they finally reached the bottom, Rogers alive, Doss barely conscious from pain and exhaustion, the rope gave up completely, falling in loose coils around them like the shed skin of some impossible snake. Dr. Martinez knelt beside them both, his face showing the strain of a night spent receiving wounded men from what had seemed like certain death. 17, he said quietly. You got 17 men off that ridge. Doss tried to speak, but his voice had given out hours ago. Instead, he looked up at the cliff face where the rope had hung, then at his hands, which would carry scars from this night for the rest of his life. The abandoned DP-27 machine gun remained on the ridge above, unfired and forgotten, while 17 empty stretchers told the story of one man's refusal to accept the impossible. Years later, when the medal ceremonies were over and the newspaper interviews had faded to memory, Doss would still wake some nights to the sound of that rope creaking in the wind. The official reports called it a miraculous rescue, a testament to courage under fire. But Doss knew the truth was simpler and more terrifying. Sometimes when everything reasonable says to stop, faith means continuing anyway. Not because you expect miracles, but because stopping means accepting that wounded men will die while you watch. The rope had held 17 evacuations because Doss never stopped believing it would hold one more. That was the real secret, the one he never shared. Faith wasn't about expecting divine intervention, but about continuing to work when divine intervention was the only explanation left for why you were still alive. In his old age, the smell of wet rope could still bring it all back. The weight of wounded men in his arms, the sound of strands parting under impossible strain, the faces of soldiers he'd carried down from Hacksaw Ridge on a line that should have failed hours before it finally did. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.